September 14th, 1978. 11:47 a.m. A windowless conference room on the third floor of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Robert Hansen sat across from his Soviet handler, reviewing a list of active American intelligence assets in Moscow. What made this moment extraordinary was not the exchange itself. Dead drops and covert meetings were routine in the espionage trade, but rather that Hansen believed he was conducting a sanctioned counterintelligence operation. The man across from him, introduced through channels Hansen trusted implicitly, was supposedly a double agent being run by the CIA to feed disinformation to the KGB. Hansen was there to provide the bait, carefully curated intelligence that would make the deception credible. He had been doing this for 11 months. Every document he passed, every name he revealed, every operational detail he shared, all of it approved, he thought, by his superiors as part of an elaborate game of strategic deception. The irony would take years to surface. There was no double agent. There was no sanctioned operation. The man across from him was KGB, and Hansen had been compromising American intelligence for nearly a year without knowing it. To understand how a trained intelligence officer could operate as an enemy asset while believing himself a loyal American, you have to go back to the architecture of Cold War counterintelligence itself, a world where deception was layered so deeply that even the deceivers could lose track of which side they served. The late 1970s represented a particularly unstable period in the intelligence wars between Washington and Moscow. The CIA was still reeling from the Church Committee investigations, which had exposed decades of illegal domestic surveillance, assassination plots, and rogue operations. Morale was shattered. Experienced officers had resigned or been forced out. The agency was rebuilding its Soviet division under intense congressional scrutiny, trying to maintain operational effectiveness while proving it could police itself. Into this vacuum stepped a new generation of officers, younger and less experienced, tasked with running some of the most sensitive operations in American intelligence history. The KGB, meanwhile, had spent the previous decade perfecting what they called provocation operations. Elaborate schemes designed not just to gather intelligence, but to manipulate the perceptions and actions of enemy services. The goal was not merely to steal secrets, but to make the Americans steal their own secrets for you, to turn their systems against them so seamlessly that they would never notice the inversion. Robert Hansen joined the FBI in 1976, transferring to the Bureau's Intelligence Division in early 1978. His background seemed ideal for counterintelligence work. A master's degree in business administration, fluency in Russian, a quiet intensity that suggested both competence and discretion. He was assigned to a unit tasked with identifying and neutralizing Soviet intelligence operations on American soil. The work was technical, detail-oriented, and largely invisible, exactly the kind of assignment that attracted officers who preferred substance over recognition. Hansen's colleagues described him as brilliant but distant, capable of extraordinary analytical work, but uncomfortable with the interpersonal dynamics that defined much of intelligence culture. He attended Mass daily, kept a crucifix on his desk, and spoke frequently about duty and moral clarity. These qualities made him seem both trustworthy and slightly odd, a combination that, in the intelligence world, often signals either exceptional integrity or exceptional vulnerability. What his colleagues did not know was that Hansen had been approached 6 months into his tenure by a man who identified himself as a CIA officer running a highly classified operation that required FBI cooperation. The approach happened in a parking garage in Arlington, Virginia, on a Tuesday afternoon in March 1978. Hansen had just finished a meeting with a source, and was walking to his car when a man in his early 40s, wearing a gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase, stepped out from between two vehicles and called Hansen's name. The man knew details about Hansen's work that should have been compartmented: specific case files, the names of sources Hansen was handling, even the internal code designations for ongoing operations. He introduced himself as Thomas Garrett, a senior officer in the CIA's Soviet division, and explained that he needed Hansen's help with what he called a matter of extreme sensitivity. Garrett said that the CIA had successfully recruited a high-ranking KGB officer stationed in Washington, a man with access to Soviet intelligence operations targeting the United States. The problem, Garrett explained, was credibility. For the defection to be valuable, the KGB had to believe their officer was still loyal, still operational, still feeding them genuine intelligence. This required what Garrett called controlled compromise, the deliberate sacrifice of real intelligence, carefully selected to be valuable enough to maintain the defector's credibility, but not so damaging as to outweigh the strategic benefits of having a source inside KGB headquarters. The FBI, Garrett said, had been chosen to provide some of this material because bureau cases were less likely to raise suspicions within the CIA itself, where the defectors' bona fides were still being evaluated by skeptical counterintelligence officers. Garrett's pitch was sophisticated because it exploited several psychological and institutional vulnerabilities simultaneously. First, it appealed to Hansen's sense of importance. He was being brought into an operation so sensitive that it required interagency cooperation at the highest levels. Second, it leveraged the known tensions between the CIA and FBI, suggesting that the Bureau had been selected precisely because it operated outside the CIA's internal politics. Third, it provided a moral framework that aligned with Hansen's self-image. He would be sacrificing short-term tactical intelligence to secure a long-term strategic advantage, protecting American interests through difficult but necessary choices. Fourth, and most critically, Garrett's knowledge of compartmented information seemed to verify his credentials. In the intelligence community, access to classified material serves as a form of authentication. If someone knows what they should not know unless they are who they claim to be, then they must be who they claim to be. This logic is sound until you consider that the KGB might have penetrated the very systems that generate and protect that compartmented information, giving them exactly the knowledge they need to impersonate legitimate officers. The operational protocol Garrett established was simple and, to Hansen, entirely consistent with how sensitive interagency operations were run. They would meet every 6 to 8 weeks, always at different locations, always with minimal advance notice. Hansen would bring documents and information that Garrett specified: reports on Soviet intelligence officers operating in the United States, details of FBI surveillance operations, assessments of sources and methods. Garrett would review the material, sometimes photographing it, sometimes taking the originals, and provide Hansen with guidance on what to collect next. There was no paperwork, no formal tasking, no written authorization. Garrett explained this as necessary operational security. The fewer people who knew about the operation, the less chance of a leak that could compromise the defector. He said that authorization came from the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence himself, but that Hansen should not attempt to verify this through normal channels. The operation, Garrett emphasized, was compartmented at a level above Hansen's clearance. His job was to provide the material and trust that it was being used appropriately. For an officer trained to operate within strict hierarchical structures, this guidance was both unusual and strangely reassuring. It confirmed that he was involved in something important enough to require extraordinary security measures. Over the next 11 months, Hansen provided Garrett with a devastating array of intelligence. He handed over the identities of 3 Soviet officials who were cooperating with the FBI, including one who had provided information about KGB operations in Western Europe. He gave Garrett detailed reports on FBI surveillance techniques, including the technical specifications of listening devices and the procedures used to monitor Soviet diplomatic facilities. He provided assessments of Soviet intelligence officers stationed in Washington, identifying which ones the FBI considered vulnerable to recruitment and which ones were suspected of running American sources. He shared information about ongoing counterintelligence investigations, including the names of Americans under suspicion for espionage. Each time, Garrett praised the quality of the material and assured Hansen that it was being used exactly as intended to strengthen the defector's position and extract more valuable intelligence from Moscow. Hansen kept no records of these meetings. He told no one, not even his wife, about his role in the operation. He believed he was doing exactly what a good intelligence officer should do, following orders, maintaining security, and serving his country's interests, even when the work required moral compromise. The first indication that something was wrong came in August 1979, when one of the Soviet officials Hansen had identified was arrested in Moscow and executed for treason. The FBI learned about the arrest through a different source, a KGB officer who had recently defected and was being debriefed by the CIA. The defector mentioned, almost in passing, that the KGB had recently rolled up an American spy network, executing 1 officer and imprisoning 2 others. When FBI counterintelligence officers cross-referenced the names with their own files, they realized that all 3 had been among the sources Hansen had discussed with Garrett. The timing was impossible to ignore. Each arrest had occurred within weeks of Hansen's meetings. But the FBI's initial assumption was not that Hansen had been compromised. It was that there must be a leak somewhere else in the system, perhaps in the CIA's handling of the defector, perhaps in the communications between agencies. The idea that a trusted FBI officer could be working for the KGB seemed less plausible than the idea that the CIA had made a mistake. Hansen himself began to suspect something was wrong around the same time, but his suspicions took a different form. He noticed that Garrett seemed increasingly interested in operational details that had nothing to do with maintaining the defector's credibility. Instead of asking for information that would make the KGB believe their officer was still loyal, Garrett was asking for information that would help the KGB identify and neutralize American intelligence operations. He wanted to know which Soviet diplomats were under surveillance, which ones the FBI planned to approach for recruitment, which technical operations were planned or ongoing. When Hansen asked how this information supported the defector operation, Garrett's explanations became vague and circular. He said that the defector needed to demonstrate access to current intelligence, that the KGB was becoming suspicious, that the operation required deeper commitment to remain credible. But something in Garrett's tone had shifted. The confidence was still there, but it was now accompanied by a subtle insistence, a pressure that had not been present in their earlier meetings. Hansen began to feel that he was being managed rather than consulted, that his role had changed from collaborator to source. The moment of realization came in October 1979, during what would be their final meeting. They met in a hotel room in Crystal City, a location Garrett had chosen. Hansen brought a file containing information about an upcoming FBI operation to install listening devices in the Soviet consulate in San Francisco. As he handed over the file, he asked Garrett a direct question: who, specifically, had authorized this operation? Garrett's response was smooth and immediate. He named the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence and added the name of a senior FBI official who supposedly knew about the arrangement. But Hansen had done something unusual in the days before the meeting. He had checked. Not through official channels, which would have violated the compartmentation Garrett had insisted on, but through a personal contact, a former colleague who now worked in the CIA's Soviet division. Hansen had asked, hypothetically, whether there were any joint FBI-CIA operations involving controlled compromise of sources. His contact had said no, definitively. There were no such operations. The CIA's policy, especially after the Church Committee investigations, was to avoid exactly that kind of risk. Any operation involving the deliberate sacrifice of intelligence would require presidential authorization and would be documented, compartmented, and controlled through formal channels. There would be paperwork. There would be oversight. There would be a paper trail. Hansen did not confront Garrett in that hotel room. He handed over the file, listened to Garrett's instructions for their next meeting, and left. But he did not attend the next meeting. Instead, he went to his supervisor at the FBI and reported that he believed he had been the target of a KGB recruitment operation. He described the meetings with Garrett, the material he had provided, and his growing suspicion that the entire defector story had been a fabrication. His supervisor's reaction was immediate and severe. Hansen was placed on administrative leave, his security clearance was suspended, and a damage assessment team was assembled to determine what he had compromised and how. The investigation took 4 months. Analysts reviewed every document Hansen had provided to Garrett, cross-referenced them with known KGB operations, and traced the consequences of each disclosure. The results were catastrophic. 3 Soviet sources had been executed. 2 major technical operations had been compromised and shut down. The KGB had gained detailed knowledge of FBI surveillance capabilities, allowing them to adjust their own operations and evade detection. The damage was not just tactical, but strategic. The KGB now knew how the FBI identified and recruited sources, how it conducted surveillance, how it prioritized targets. This knowledge would shape Soviet intelligence operations for years, making it harder for the United States to penetrate KGB networks and easier for the KGB to protect its own officers. The investigation also revealed how the deception had been constructed. Thomas Garrett was not his real name. He was a KGB officer named Dmitry Polyakov, operating under deep cover in the United States. Polyakov had been in Washington since 1976, ostensibly working as a trade representative, but actually running a network of sources and conducting active measures operations. The KGB had identified Hansen as a potential target through a combination of surveillance and analysis. They knew he was new to counterintelligence work, that he had access to sensitive information, and that his personality profile suggested both idealism and isolation, qualities that could be exploited. The approach in the parking garage had been carefully planned. Polyakov's knowledge of compartmented information had not come from penetrating CIA systems, but from a different source. A mole inside the FBI itself, someone who had provided the KGB with enough detail about Hansen's work to make Polyakov's impersonation credible. This mole was never identified. The FBI suspected several officers, but could never gather enough evidence to make an arrest. The possibility that there was still a penetration inside the bureau, someone who had enabled Hansen's recruitment and might still be operational, haunted the counterintelligence division for years. What made Hansen's case particularly disturbing was not just the damage he caused, but the mechanism by which he was deceived. He had not been blackmailed or bribed. He had not been ideologically converted or personally compromised. He had been tricked into believing that his betrayal was loyalty, that his cooperation with the enemy was service to his country. This inversion was possible because of the nature of intelligence work itself, a world where deception is routine, where officers are trained to lie convincingly and to accept lies as operational necessity, where the line between authorized and unauthorized activity is often unclear even to those conducting the operations. Hansen had operated exactly as he had been trained to operate, following orders, maintaining security, trusting his superiors, and accepting that some aspects of the work would remain opaque even to him. The KGB had not subverted his loyalty. They had weaponized it, turning his commitment to duty into a mechanism for betrayal. The legal and institutional consequences were complex and, in some ways, unsatisfying. Hansen was not charged with espionage. The evidence against him was strong, but much of it was classified and could not be presented in open court without revealing sources and methods that the FBI wanted to protect. There was also the problem of intent. Hansen genuinely believed he had been operating under CIA authorization, and proving that he knew or should have known otherwise was difficult. The FBI's own procedures were partly to blame. The lack of formal documentation, the reliance on personal trust, the compartmentation that made it nearly impossible for officers to verify the legitimacy of operations they were asked to support. Charging Hansen would have required admitting these systemic failures in public, exposing the agency to criticism and potentially to legal liability. Instead, Hansen was allowed to resign quietly. He signed a non-disclosure agreement, accepted the loss of his pension, and agreed never to work in intelligence or law enforcement again. The official story was that he had resigned for personal reasons. His colleagues were told nothing. The damage assessment remained classified. Polyakov, the KGB officer who had run Hansen, disappeared from Washington in early 1980. The FBI believed he had been recalled to Moscow, either because the KGB feared he had been compromised or because his mission was complete. There were rumors that he had been promoted, that he had been given a medal, that he had been assigned to train other officers in the techniques he had used against Hansen. But these were only rumors. The KGB's internal records from this period remained classified, and Polyakov himself was never heard from again. Some intelligence analysts believe he was eventually executed, either because he fell out of favor with his superiors or because the KGB discovered that he had been providing information to the CIA before his assignment in Washington, a double agent who had been tripled, then quadrupled, until even he might not have known which side he truly served. Others believe he retired quietly and lived out his life in Moscow, his role in one of the most successful KGB operations of the Cold War, known only to a handful of officers who would never speak of it. For Hansen, the years after his resignation were marked by isolation and silence. He could not explain what had happened without violating the non-disclosure agreement he had signed. He could not defend himself against the quiet rumors that circulated among former colleagues, that he had been careless, that he had been compromised, that he had somehow failed in ways that were never fully explained. He found work as a security consultant for private companies, advising on counterintelligence and information protection, a role that must have carried its own bitter ironies. He attended Mass daily, as he always had, and spoke to almost no one about his years in intelligence. Friends from that period described him as haunted, a man living with knowledge he could not share, and guilt he could not expiate. He died in 1998 of a heart attack, alone in his apartment. Among his possessions, investigators found a journal, handwritten, documenting his meetings with Polyakov in meticulous detail. The journal had been kept in violation of his non-disclosure agreement, but it was also the most complete record of the operation that existed. The FBI classified it immediately and has never released it. The Hansen case, not to be confused with the later and more famous Robert Hansen case of the 1990s and 2000s, revealed several critical vulnerabilities in American counterintelligence during the Cold War. First, it demonstrated that the KGB had developed techniques for manipulating not just individuals, but entire institutional systems, turning the very mechanisms designed to protect secrets into tools for extracting them. Second, it showed that the compartmentation and secrecy that were supposed to protect intelligence operations could also be used to isolate officers and prevent them from recognizing when they had been compromised. Third, it exposed the dangers of informal operational protocols, the handshake agreements, the unwritten understandings, the trust-based systems that allowed operations to proceed without documentation or oversight. These vulnerabilities were not unique to the FBI or to the 1970s. They were structural features of intelligence work itself, inherent in any system that required secrecy, deception, and trust to function. The broader implications of the case were debated within the intelligence community for years. Some argued that it proved the need for stricter compartmentation, more rigorous vetting, and tighter controls on interagency cooperation. Others argued the opposite, that excessive compartmentation had enabled the deception, that Hansen might have recognized the operation as fraudulent if he had been able to discuss it with colleagues or verify it through official channels. The debate was never resolved because it touched on a fundamental paradox of intelligence work: the need to share information to be effective versus the need to restrict information to be secure. Every solution to one problem created new vulnerabilities to the other. The KGB understood this paradox and exploited it ruthlessly, designing operations that would succeed regardless of which approach the Americans chose. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the question of how many other officers might have been deceived in similar ways. The KGB's success with Hansen suggested that the technique was repeatable, that other officers might be operating under similar delusions, believing themselves loyal while serving enemy interests. The FBI conducted an internal review, interviewing hundreds of officers and examining thousands of operations, looking for patterns that might indicate similar compromises. They found several cases where officers had provided information to individuals whose credentials could not be fully verified, where operations had been conducted without proper documentation, where the chain of authorization was unclear or broken. Some of these cases were investigated further. Others were quietly closed, the officers reassigned or retired, the details buried in classified files. The review concluded that the problem was not widespread, but also that it was impossible to be certain. The nature of the deception was such that officers who had been compromised might never realize it, might continue to believe they were serving their country even as they betrayed it. The psychological impact on Hansen himself became a subject of study within the intelligence community's behavioral analysis units. How does a person live with the knowledge that they were deceived so completely, that their judgment, the very quality that made them valuable as an intelligence officer, had been turned against them? The journal Hansen kept suggested a man trying to reconstruct his own narrative, to understand the operation in retrospect, to identify the moments when he should have known, should have questioned, should have refused. But the journal also revealed something else. Even years after the operation ended, Hansen was not entirely certain that Polyakov had been KGB. He considered the possibility that Polyakov had been exactly who he claimed to be, that the operation had been legitimate, that the arrests and compromises had been coincidental or the result of other leaks. This uncertainty was itself a kind of torture, a permanent ambiguity that prevented closure or resolution. The KGB had not just deceived Hansen, they had created a deception so thorough that even after it was exposed, it remained partially credible, leaving him unable to fully trust his own understanding of what had happened. The case also raised questions about institutional accountability. The FBI's decision not to prosecute Hansen, while understandable from a security perspective, meant that the full details of the operation were never subjected to public scrutiny. The damage assessment remained classified. The systemic failures that had enabled the deception were never fully addressed. Officers who had approved or facilitated Hansen's meetings with Polyakov, either through direct authorization or through negligent oversight, were never held accountable. The institution protected itself by protecting its secrets, but in doing so, it also protected the vulnerabilities that had made the operation possible. This pattern would repeat itself in other cases, other agencies, other decades. The tension between transparency and security, between accountability and operational effectiveness, was never resolved because it could not be resolved. Every choice involved trade-offs, and every trade-off created new risks. In the end, the question that haunted Hansen, and that continues to haunt intelligence professionals who study his case, is not whether he should have known he was being deceived, but whether it was possible to know. The KGB had constructed a deception that exploited every assumption, every procedure, every institutional norm that governed how American intelligence officers operated. They had turned the system against itself so completely that an officer following all the rules, doing everything he had been trained to do, could still end up working for the enemy. This was not a failure of individual judgment, but a failure of the system itself, a vulnerability built into the very architecture of secret intelligence work. And if it happened to Hansen, a careful, conscientious officer who believed deeply in duty and loyalty, then it could happen to anyone. That realization, that the system itself could be weaponized, that loyalty could be inverted without the loyal ever knowing, was perhaps the most damaging consequence of the operation, more lasting than any intelligence Hansen provided, more corrosive than any network he compromised. The story of how a CIA agent discovered he was working for the KGB is, in the end, a story about the limits of certainty in a world built on deception. It is a reminder that in the intelligence wars of the Cold War, the most effective operations were not those that stole secrets, but those that manipulated the systems designed to protect them, turning trust into vulnerability and loyalty into betrayal. And it is a warning that the question, "Whose side am I on?" may not always have a clear answer, even for those who believe they know.